Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Peacock. My guest today is Ward Hiney, a self-defense instructor at Endeavor Defense and Fitness and a Krav Maga black belt. In this episode, we discuss why combat sports are not bad for self-defense. In fact, we go a step further and argue that combat sports are better for self-defense than standard traditional martial arts training, even potentially for weapons defense. This is another toe stepper, and I know it's a controversial opinion, but hear out Ward's argument. So if you're excited to jump in, hit that subscribe button on your podcatcher now. All right, Ward. So there's an idea out there that combat sports are no good for self-defense. If you want to have good self-defense, you really have to get it from like a combatives or a military type training, or in some cases, and this is of course popular in the traditional martial arts crowd, that you have to go to a traditional martial art to actually get good self-defense training rather than from combat sports such as MMA or boxing, kickboxing, jiu-jitsu now, things like that. And I was wondering what your view was on that statement.
Yeah, I generally disagree at this point in my life. But that said, you can see why that idea would develop. If you were, there are people's legitimate experiences, like guys that came up doing a traditional martial art believed that to be self-defense training, and then went and, worked doors. Right, you start working a door and you find out real quick that a lot of that is not functioning. So, you have guys like Jeff Thompson and that school of thought where, maybe before we had as much data from the combat sports side and MMA, as a generality, that would have more accuracy than it does now. But yeah, I generally disagree with the proposition that you have to, or you should avoid combat sport. I think that would be the more accurate way to put it. I think you need an athletic base. You need to develop the basic ability to, as well as the psychology of dealing with somebody that is resisting, and you rarely find that in self-defense focused, reality-based self-defense, or the call it like tactical LARPing, right? That happens in a lot of the weekend seminar deals. So
yeah, but just to be clear, scenario-based training does have value, though.
Oh, absolutely. You have to understand what you're doing with it. I recently, even just this past weekend, I went and did the integrative defensive strategies. They called it the Apex. It was like this invitational advanced handgun camp. They were doing a lot of fighting over guns and fighting with guns. And there was a scenario portion of that. And the guy who runs that is Todd Fossey. And I don't think there's anybody better at doing scenario work than he is. But I had experiences during his scenario work that exposed training scars I have from poorly done scenario work. So I'd say that scenario work is extremely valuable, but it's also extremely dangerous. From the self-defense sort of angle. Yeah.
And would you say, just so for the listeners, some of my listeners might not be familiar with the differences between sparring and scenario-based training, because I think there's a lot of conflation between the two, especially with the reality self-defense crowd.
Yep.
Some of them at least seem to think that you don't need sparring or a lot of sparring if you do scenario-based training. But my understanding from talking to you before is that scenario-based training is useful for what's going on in the environment, but at some point, once you learn how to beat the scenario, a lot of times its utility kind of diminishes, because then you kind of know what you're supposed to do, and the variability of it kind of diminishes the more you do it.
Yeah, especially if the person designing and running those scenarios isn't very good at what they do. Um, the There's a diminishing return to continuing to do scenarios, because the skill that you're building in the scenario has a lot more to do with, it's a lot more about a mental skill. It's the skill of decision making, and pattern recognition and prioritizing what needs to be paid attention to, in a more tactical way. Sparring is actually developing a physical skill. The way that I look at it. You could look at. Let's see, how would you? I would say that trying to liken this to like driving a car. Drilling is sort of like driving your car around the empty parking lot, right? And just developing just the pattern of what you do to make the car do what you want it to do. Sparring is sort of like going out with a bunch of student drivers and trying to create like a traffic scenario with them. And then the scenario training is sort of like adding stressors onto that, adding real world stressors, right? So add stoplights, have a crash occur, that sort of thing. That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah. So basically, when you spar, you are focusing on one, or in some cases more than one opponent, depending on what sort of sparring exercise you're doing. And then when you step into scenario work, you broaden, your environment broadens. Now you have to navigate a situation more like, I guess, a real situation would be, because now you have, like, I've seen scenarios where you have people that are bystanders. Some of the bystanders will step in, some of them won't. Some of them could be buddies. Like, you never know what's going to happen. A lot of times the scenario, I don't know what you would call them, the chief or the dungeon master, will kind of give people directions or guidance on what to do. And the person in the scenario doesn't know. So it adds an element of realism. So you kind of broaden the environment. Now, sometimes it's limited in the sense that you might not have sparring in a scenario. It might be more about other things. But in scenarios where, and I know I've seen Craig Douglas do this before too, you have scenarios where there's a lot going on, including a fight, like an actual sparring match. The overlap is actually quite a bit, but the scenario is much broader than a sparring match. And you definitely need sparring, because scenario is not going to give you enough, I guess you could say, iteration cycles to actually develop those physical tactical skills.
Yes, and the amount of work that goes into setting up a scenario that is well run is prohibitive for doing it a million times, right? And maybe when virtual reality kind of catches up, there might be a change that happens there with the technology. But I think the significance from an instructor standpoint, the really significant point in scenarios versus sparring is, in sparring, you can submit, right? Like when we're rolling, when we're grappling, if you throw something on me, I'm going to submit. In a scenario, you need to be very, very careful that the good guy never submits. So you don't want to program a pathway where in the real world here, I'm allowed to give up. So in scenario work, if you are shot, you don't die, right? You got shot. If you get stabbed, you got stabbed. You don't die. We're having to be careful with this. The program that I'm spending the most time on working right now is a 6-week weapon retention curriculum, and like in-fight weapon access curriculum. And we're being very deliberate and very careful about, because we are sparring with weapons. So when we're sparring and playing with weapons, it's a different rule set, where one of the pathways to submission is to establish a position where you can get several lethal shots or several lethal stabs, right? It's just another, you can choke someone, or you can shoot them, or you can stab them, if those are the tools that you have on you during the exercise. In those sparring rounds, one player is allowed to submit or die, right? I mean, if you're mounted with both arms trapped and someone's firing away at your head, it's safe to say that you submit. But when we go putting a bunch of real world circumstances into it, like when we go into doing scenarios in the last week, that's no longer going to be the case for one of the participants. They have to continue to fight, because there's a training scar that will develop. You see this in force-on-force scenarios with people that jump into force-on-force scenarios before they have a lot of training in this kind of stuff. Someone will shoot at them and they will fall over. It may not even be. They may have a simunition pass over their shoulder and they will be, oh, I fell over, I'm dead, I lost, right?
Right.
If you program that in, right, in the sort of the heightened stress and the heightened realism of a scenario, if you get someone to do that even one time, it's hard to make them stop. You have to immediately remediate that situation and run them back through that scenario, because those kinds of training scars are deep and they don't come out until that similar stress, that similar situation happens again.
Right. So because a scenario is in many ways more representative of a real life crisis situation, if you train very poorly in a situation like that, there's a good chance that you could give up too early or make a fatal mistake during a scenario if you allow those bad habits to continue in the scenario. And I guess this would probably be counterintuitive to some people listening, but one of the bad habits is to actually let people give up too early in a scenario, even if they've been shot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. And the people watch too much television and too much TV, so they think that when they get shot that they have to fall down.
Yeah. Higher percentage of people survive gunshots than survive stab wounds. So
right. So it's like 73% or something like that. Like around there. It's actually in its weird way, it's heartening to hear that you're more than likely able to survive a gunshot wound.
Yep.
In most cases.
Yep.
Knives are the hidden scary ones.
Yes, knives are within arm's reach. I would far rather deal with someone with a firearm. Like,
right. Yeah, and most people in the know, especially people that have trained in a few martial arts, would echo that, I think. But people who don't know anything about violence are always more afraid of the loud, clashing bang stick that makes big noises.
Yeah, it's a constant film trope that when someone pulls a gun, they have control of the room and however many people.
Right.
There's no reason for that to be the case.
Right, which doesn't always represent real life. But I know that this is a position you have now later in life. But did you always have this opinion that combat sports could be applied to self-defense practically and effectively, or did you go through a sort of evolution?
No, there was certainly an evolution to it. It's probably easiest to explain this via a quick training background overview.
Sure, yeah.
So I started out shooting handguns competitively. That's kind of what I wanted to do. I just thought it was cool. And so I did a lot of gun training early on. I was like 20, 22. Then sort of as I continued to run those competitions, I got to thinking about different self-defense scenarios, getting myself into some situations where another skill set would have been nice to have within, a couple arms reach. So I knew that that was a thing, that like I knew that was a hole in my game, let's say. So I went looking after, what sort of looked like the best stuff. And at the time, all of my handgun training had taught me, and all of my competition stuff had taught me, that the simpler and more gross motor a thing is, and the fewer things I have to think about when doing it, the better. Which is a premise that I still, in general, agree with. But the people that were echoing that approach were the RBSD, World War II combatives type people, right? So your Kelly McCann, your Lee Morrisons, that kind of thing. And this was back in like the days of Paladin Press. So I would get build my action library there with some of that stuff. And then I found a Krav Maga school that was opening. And that sort of seemed like it was the same kind of approach to the whole deal. Like, let's end every fight in 5 seconds and be done with it.
Right.
So I went after that. I started training in that, and it was maybe 3 years into that, I was asked to start instructing. And right about that time, we had a guy named Ryan Hoover come up and run us through some stuff. And in the Krav Maga community, our school was one of the better and more violent ones. So we go places and be able to perform at a level higher than most of those schools. But when Hoover came in, we sort of asked him, what's the main thing that we're missing? And he was like, you guys can't stand up wrestle at all. So we started incorporating that. And the more we incorporated that, the more we figured out that being good at wrestling solved a lot of self-defense situations more quickly and more dependably than blasting away strikes. So over the course of doing that, training stand-up wrestling, we started a jiu-jitsu program at the gym, and I just fell in love with that as a sport. And the strangest thing was that the better I got at grappling, the more quickly and the safer I was in all of our self-defense scenario type work. The quicker I could put somebody on the ground, the easier my escape was.
Imagine that.
Right. Shockingly. And when we would do those scenarios and those role play things, if somebody, everybody involved in those has their own psychology at play. So if you upset somebody by hitting them a little too hard in the scenario and they don't feel like falling over, they don't have to fall over, right? But if you apply a grappling solution to that they simply cannot prevent, and then you dump them, they don't really have the option. Which is a pretty interesting analog to the real world, right? You start hitting somebody and they decide that wasn't hard enough to knock me out, but it is hard enough to anger me. Now I've got a worse problem than if I had just dumped them. And so gradually over that experience, came to believe that the predictability of grappling-based solutions to self-defense problems made it the skill set I would prioritize above striking skill sets. Not to say that you can't solve self-defense problems with striking, but I think it's more predictable. Grappling solutions appear to me to be more predictable in my experience.
Right. And that's because it adds, first of all, you're controlling variables up front, whether it's real life or just in a training situation. So you're trying to tie up limbs and impede the movement. If they're on the ground, you're controlling their hips, which is kind of the only way they can move is if they can move their hips for the most part. So I came to this same conclusion by myself and then we kind of met later on, and I was like, who is this guy who mirrors all my thoughts? But yeah, and then the funny thing is that this is actually becoming more popular in the combatives, reality-based self-defense arena. Now, there's actually certain techniques that you're seeing pop up, even among people who used to be the run-of-the-mill Krav Maga guys are now starting to switch to more, I guess because I call it control-based. I think Mr. Douglas calls it jiu-jitsu based, and some people call it grappling based. But whatever you call it, it's all basically wrestling basics. to control, mostly standing, to control situations, so that you don't have to worry about being able to dodge and have your guard up the whole time or whatever. That always introduces a greater degree of uncertainty if you want to go toe to toe to a guy and square up and trade punches.
Yeah, all of the explosive power. In order to deliver explosive power, you have to have velocity. And when you apply wrestling, you take away a lot of the explosive power. You take away a lot of the velocity. And
distance as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's always funny, when I hear people from both the traditional martial arts and from like the Krav Maga reality-based self-defense camps, that they always talk about techniques that the little guy can use or the 90-pound woman can use. Yeah. And what they mean is a punch to the groin or a kick to the groin and a punch to the throat and a poke to the eyes or something like that. Yeah. But the problem with those techniques is that you have to be within arm's reach. You can't be too close. And, if somebody has longer arms than you and they, for example, press you against the wall and they drop their chin a little bit or lift their shoulder or their leg, they blade their stance and their knee is a certain way, those techniques suddenly are almost nullified.
Yes.
And then you don't have anything else. You don't have anything left except to try and run. But then you're trying to run against somebody who is, we're imagining, larger, faster, more athletic.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that as much grief as grappling gets from the reality-based self-defense community, at least historically, is it actually does what they claim their tactics do. It actually lets a little guy come in and use leverage to tie somebody up so that they can't hurt them anymore, and they can control them until they have a chance to access a weapon, or maybe they can tie them up and hit them, or they can knock them down and run, or like just whatever they need to do to survive, navigate the situation. Wrestling actually lets them do that in a predictable way, whereas vital striking it doesn't. And there's no evidence anywhere that it does.
Yeah, distance. One of the things we've said is distance management is risk management, right? And that's really the entire purpose of a self-defense curriculum. Ought to be risk mitigation. Ought to be risk management. So we were talking about this this weekend with a SWAT officer up there who was teaching us a lot of stuff about accessing weapons in vehicles and shooting through glass and that kind of thing. And he made the point that a lot of risk management, and I think he's quoting somebody else at this point, but a lot of risk management are small habitual changes, right? So when you put your seatbelt on when you get in the car, that's risk management. And you're far more likely to need that than you are any of the other stuff we're going to do. So similarly, I feel like self-defense programs ought to be about habitual changes we can make to manage risk, right? So we'll talk about, you can only really, talk about situational awareness. That has to be something that you develop just generally outside of.
Right.
And you have limited training time to do in the gym. So you need to do the things that you can't do outside of it, right? So,
yeah.
But yeah, that's the ethos behind at least our grappling-based approach to it, or my grappling-based approach to it is, and I'm more like this than even several of the people at our gym, that, managing distance is managing risk. And the only way to effectively manage distance is to attach yourself to the thing you're trying to manage your distance from.
Yeah, and yeah, there are ways with striking to manage distance, but they're less plausible, I guess, as far as what's the term I'm reaching for? High percentage, I guess you would say.
Much more technique to that. It's hard to learn.
Yeah, and you with wrestling, you just need to control you don't even have to be that good at it. You just control the distance. You grab onto something and then you maneuver yourself.
Yeah.
Most people don't have enough grappling knowledge to be able to defend against something like that. Whereas with a boxing or a Krav Maga or a karate-based striking distance management, if you're really skilled, I mean, it's like magic, but you need a lot of space, and there's a lot of uncertainties that you can't that are less high percentage than wrestling would be, because you don't have control of the body in most cases. So even somebody who is just a street fighter, who's been in a few fights, not a boxer, but he still has a boxer's chance to catch your chin if you make any miscalculation at all. You run, you trip over something, you run into you backstep into a wall, and then you get disoriented for a second. You don't know in those situations.
Yeah.
And it seems to me much more plausible, much more high percentage, that you could close the distance as soon as possible. Maybe definitely cover yourself with strikes if you're that far away, and then tie them up, and then figure out what you're going to do from there. Give yourself a second to think.
One of the arguments that I've mounted, even among the instructors at our gym, is...
Hey, sorry to interrupt you right in the middle of the podcast, but I promise it'll only take a second. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Combat Learning email newsletter at combatlearning.com/newsletter. Not only will you never miss an episode of the Combat Learning podcast, you'll get exclusive tips and resources straight to your inbox. And I'm giving away my ebook, An Introduction to Motor Learning for Martial Artists, so you can get up to speed on the central topics of this podcast. But that's not even it. I'll also invite you to our private Facebook discussion group so you can ask any questions you want or discuss any topic related to teaching and learning martial arts. And all of this is 100% free. So go to combatlearning.com/newsletter right now to subscribe and claim all this cool stuff for yourself. That's combatlearning.com/newsletter.
How many professional MMA fighters have the ability to throw one or two shots and have knockouts happen? Right. I mean, of course, their opponents are better, but that's almost an innate skill. Like, you can train to throw harder, but the ability to just one shot drop somebody is low. So what happens, even completely untrained street fights, you get on WorldStar, get on YouTube and look, as soon as somebody gets clocked, they collapse distance because they know that the velocity is less. So say you get your good elbow in, if that's not a knockout, that person is likely trying to attach themselves to you. So congratulations, and now you're wrestling.
Yeah. And they I heard one guy describe it as a spaghetti, basically. They turn into spaghetti and drop on you and try to grab anything. Yeah. And it's like a very primitive version of, I guess, a boxing or a kickboxing clinch, where you're getting a little bit too overwhelmed in the pocket, or at melee range, as some people would call it. And so you move in to give yourself a really slight breather, and then try to maneuver yourself into a more advantageous angle from that point. So there's definitely there's strategy to it. But even if you're not a boxer, you kind of naturally like, oh shoot, I can't go backwards because I'm going to be on my heels, and he's probably going to punch me again because he can move forward faster than I can move backwards. So I need to go towards him because now he doesn't have enough room to create the velocity to knock me out.
Yeah. Watch any, tough man, rough and rowdy brawl, that kind of stuff. Like, there's about, 20 seconds of throwing wild punches, and then everybody wants to get in close where they can't get hit in the face while they rest.
Yeah. So I want to zoom into like the main topic that we're going over, and that's actually weapons defense. So, is it possible to take the skills from combat sports and apply it to effective, practical defense against weapons, like a gun or especially a knife?
Yes, absolutely, it is. And I think it's necessary. So for the moment, let's assume that, the RBSD or Krav Maga or something has come up with the best technique to defeat someone with a knife. Even if that's the case, you could take a technique that's, say, 70% effective, but you spend 1,000, 10,000 hours running that technique against somebody who doesn't want to let you do it. So just about every way at the end of that experience, just about every way that they can move to try to escape that particular control. On the Krav Maga side, you get, let's say, once a month for an hour or two, you pick up a knife and you try to run this exact technique against someone who knows that the technique is supposed to work and so isn't allowed to fully resist, right? So you're not really... Yeah. So at the end of all that, right, who do you put the money on? The guy who has 10,000 hours doing a technique that may not be the absolute best, or the guy that has, 200 hours doing it against somebody who's not resisting? And I think what MMA has taught us is that the combat sport guy who's been doing it against somebody who doesn't want to let him do it for longer is the guy that can execute those things.
So what about rules, bro?
Yeah.
What about rules?
Right. Yeah. So obviously the rule sets that are the most liberal are the best for figuring out what works when there are no rules, right? But you don't get 10,000 hours of repetitions if you allow injurious practice, right? If you're just stabbing people for real and, ripping out eyes, you run out of training partners with eyes pretty quickly, right? And you tend to get a reputation. So even if that sort of stuff were the most effective, which it isn't, I don't know if... I think somebody's made a simulator, which is the corniest thing in the world, but a simulator for trying to gouge out an eye. The eyeball goes behind, like there's a sphincter there, and it clenches up pretty tight. It's pretty impossible to like kung pao somebody, come out with their eyeball in your thumb.
Like Kill Bill, where she does the eagle technique and plucks out the lady's eye.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Usually what happens is you'll get lacerations to the eyelid trying to do that kind of thing, which does impair vision a little bit, but it's not, it's certainly not a fight ending thing. And if you doubt that, just
you're going to be digging in there even if you try, and the person can move their arms and their head. They can move their head back. I mean, the distance is always moving. It's in flux. They can angle they can turn their neck and angle and drop their forehead and use their hands. I mean, it's a mess, and we just don't even know what it would look like because nobody's really tried it.
Yeah.
And we really don't even have a lot of examples of it in the wild either. We have people kind of going for the eyes, but it's never super effective. Yeah. It's always the person pushes away, moves their head really quick, and they get scratched, but there's not a fight ender.
Yep. Yeah. The old the Rich Dimitri shredder stuff. We've tried that, and it doesn't look as good when we do it as it does in his demos.
When he does it against wrestlers. Hey, this is a real wrestler. The funny thing about Rich Dimitri is that he shed the shredder, and now he's cut his hair and put on a suit and does like an international safety consulting thing. Now he's like all super. Oh, nice. He's not edgy anymore.
Yeah. There's probably more money. You can't.
Yeah.
The number of people that want to learn to shred, it's probably not that great.
Yeah. Yeah. There's serious people out there that are willing to pay you money for actual self-defense.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that kind of goes unsaid in the debate against rule sets, and like with the street having supposedly no rules, and then combat sports having more rules, even if less rules than training, is that when you're actually training, your reality-based self-defense people actually have more rules around training than you do as a combat sports person.
Yep. Yes, exactly. You have to, quote, be a good bad guy. I can't count how many times I was told that early on in Krav Maga training. And what's meant by that is try to react the way that we've told you a bad guy should react if getting hit this way or getting this thing done to them.
Yeah.
Which is kind of hilarious now to look back on that.
Yeah, because we know that 32-year-old Karen with 2 kids at home who drives a minivan can channel her inner thug.
Yeah.
And give you some excellent resistance without hurting you.
Yeah.
That's not to say that 32-year-old Karen with 2 children in a minivan can't be a killer if she got on the mat and did jiu-jitsu or boxing or something. She could. But she's not going to be able to channel that just out of nowhere from the bottom of her heart. She's not going to be able to be able to channel and give you super realistic actions for how a thug is gonna react.
Yeah, and that's really difficult in trying to do. There was a big push a while ago to do a lot of stress inoculation, and that's real tough.
I remember that.
I mean, I grew up. I'm from West Virginia. I grew up in a pretty hillbilly, and it's difficult for me to role play as some other kind of threatening person. Like I can role play the threatening hick pretty well, but you got to be honest with that. So when making, trying to make people yell at each other, I've done it. I've tried it 2-3 years ago and decided it had very limited stress inoculation value because of how silly most people sound.
They sound silly. Some of them don't. They don't even want to say a cuss word or anything. I mean, I didn't either. That was my issue too. I used to be a part of a program called Cobra Defense, and it had all these different scenario drills you could run, and they were just kind of run of the mill. And one of them was a stress inoculation drill where you had to stand a certain length from somebody and then just say a bunch of stuff. And you had to, be a bad guy and say threatening things. And then the person had to navigate the conversation, and then it cut off and you never could react any more than that. And both parties knew that nothing was ever actually going to escalate. So the incentive to truly practice that skill as if something could manifest was very low. And those sorts of dynamics really do subtly affect behavior and the value of that sort of practice in ways that I think a lot of people don't realize. One of the things I like about Craig Douglas's evolutions is that there really is a chance for violence to escalate, and there really is a chance for violence not to escalate. It depends on your partner, the scenario, and how deeply the person has donned the role that they have taken on.
Yeah. Yeah, he does a very good job of blending. I almost look at least the stuff that I've seen him do as sort of end user evaluation type stuff, more than necessarily taking somebody from 0 to 100. He may be taking you from 80 to 100. But yeah.
Yeah, he's raising you by 20% no matter where you come from, whether you're 0 or you're 80. He will raise you a 20 to 30% every time you come and continue to sharpen your skills. But one of the things I really appreciate about Craig Douglas is he does these excellent workshops and seminars and things, but he always tells you, hey, look, you got to stay in shape and you've got to go and train something like jiu-jitsu or boxing. You can't just come to one of these things once or twice a year. You have to keep the training in.
Yeah.
And keep the skills sharp and keep developing them so that when you come back, you're actually better than you were at the end of the last workshop.
Yeah. Yeah. We had a guy do one of our first we call it GWAC, our weapon retention stuff. Come do
I call it GWAC or guac.
We had a guy come who had done a couple of ECQCs, Craig Douglas's things, and we kept reiterating that like you need to go find a jiu-jitsu gym, and he's a 2 or 3 stripe white belt now. This dude's like 60 years old, but mean.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so we've established that combat sports can be useful for practical weapons defense. In fact, it's almost necessary for it. It is necessary for it, because you can only find some of the most, in our opinion, effective tactics from wrestling, jiu-jitsu, things like that.
Yeah,
so
training it in that modality.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is actually the most, technique selection is important, but the actual training methodology is the most important part.
Yes.
So my question to you is what is your process for translating combat sport tactics to a representative, realistic self-defense situation?
Yeah. So there are basically 2 bars that something has to clear. And the first one is the easiest. The first one is, can I do this while retaining the tools that I carry every day, and can I perform it? And then sort of even better than that is, does it enhance my ability to retain the tools I carry every day?
Okay.
So, and the sort of the corollary to that is, am I keeping track of what tools he might have? Right. So tracking limbs and that kind of thing. There may be some really cool stuff that I can do with one arm, but if I lose tactile and visual contact on the other arm, I have to assume that arm can do something. So that's a little bit different. In jiu-jitsu, I can hang out in a Russian arm position where I'm not affecting his posture immediately in a way that is dangerous when applied in a self-defense context, because I'm letting an arm be free unless I'm dramatically affecting his posture immediately. The second bar that has to clear is, can I teach it to somebody who is not does not have the training background that I do, right? Someone who's not going to do years of grappling. Okay, so there are things that, with a higher degree of sensitivity to weight and pressure, there are different things that I can pull off that I could not pull off when I was 6 months into jiu-jitsu. I'm now 3.5 or 4 years into it. As a purple belt, there's a ton of things that if I had tried to learn as a 2-stripe white belt, I would not have been able to do. And it would have been a waste of time and counterproductive for my development to try to learn to do those things.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the 2 hurdles. Basically, are we being realistic about the presence of weapons and the different objectives, right? That's another part to the practicality, is the objective is, if I can escape. And then the other bar is, can I teach this to Bob, basically, right? I have an image of a guy who will show up to this seminar, and maybe if I can convince him to do like a month trial grappling, what can I give that guy, you know? So, and then you can gradate that, right? You can tailor things for people who are jiu-jitsu players. They're going to have a foundational skill set that I can leverage for the tactical situation in a way that somebody who doesn't won't. So one of those things that I've recently started to do a little bit of a shift on is the usefulness of the Russian arm position, which I think is a fantastic position if you have a lot of time in developing control of it. So for our members, people who are at the gym, I know are going to be coming back for about a year, I will 100% take the Russian arm technique, arm drag to Russian arm, and we'll find every possible way to get there and every way to, every high percentage way to leverage that into trips and dumps and takedowns and use it to control that limb. Like we'll do that all day. If I have a seminar setting where I'm trying to give somebody things to use right now, the sort of the body lock, getting access to the back is easier to pick up on. So we'll start there. And then if somebody looks like perhaps their natural ability or whatever, then we'll talk about limb control directly with a Russian arm. With the caveats that, you guys need to train this. This is not as instinctive of a thing. And we'll maybe sort of steer the limb control discussion around, instead of teaching a very technical Russian arm, we'll teach, double wrist tie, heavy head, using that to basically just hug the arm instead of trying to get them to a technical level of proficiency. I don't know. Does that answer?
Heavy head, you mean like, that answers the question. So you mean for people who can't envision that, I think they can probably envision 2-on-1 wrist control, basically both your hands on the wrist like that. But with the heavy head, you mean that their head is pressing against their chin or creating pressure so that their posture is off balance and they can't kind of easily pull their arm out?
Yeah, the way we'll talk about that, you imagine giraffes fighting, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to, so I'll draw a graphic where if you imagine a laser that protrudes from like somebody's sternum or forehead, that center line, we will draw the example of, if I want to fight somebody, I want them to be on my center line and I want to be off of their center line. Okay, so if I put my head, you're basically in the front of your shoulder, and then I look across the front of your body, it will turn your head so that your center line is off of me, but your head is right on my center line. And that is, that's ubiquitously recognized as the like a dominant head position. So we will use heavy pressure in that direction at the same time, or double wrist tying. So both hands attached to the wrist in sort of, we refer to that as like a baseball bat. If you imagine like the old like 1920s baseball player who's posing, has the bat real stretched out, arms almost extended with the bat laying across his shoulder. That's sort of, that's how we treat that arm.
Cool. Yeah. So I had you go through that just because I think a lot of my listeners are probably going to come from like karate backgrounds and striking arts. So just I wanted to paint a picture for them so they weren't kind of left in the dust about what that means, because everyone kind of has their own terminology, their own way that they talk about certain techniques that everyone within that group immediately understands, but not everyone outside of the group. So, so cool. Very cool. So if someone has the right tool, like a Russian arm tie-up for like a knife defense, say, is it likely that they'll apply it spontaneously in a knife attack, or do they need additional training?
No, and that's where the truth of you need something more than sport comes in, because it's a different rule set, so the objectives are different. I think Craig Douglas actually just did a video about.
He did,
yeah. So it's like training, for a boxing match versus a kickboxing match. Like there's a lot of things that change, right? The rules are different, so your objectives and what the opponent is going to do and how he's going to stand, all that stuff changes a little bit. The same thing is true when you give him a knife or a gun, or you give him a weapon. The rule set changes. There's now another way for him to win, right? And because he has that thing, it's very likely that he is fixated on winning the fight that way. It's also very likely that however much you train, you are fixated on that thing too. As soon as you become aware of its presence, right? If you see a knife, good luck, There used to be a Krav Maga defense where you blocked a stab with one hand and you punched them in the face with the other hand at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, good luck, right? Good luck.
Yeah.
Not putting both of your, and that's also why we train to put both hands on the weapon-bearing limb, is that you spend your entire adult life walking around picking things up with your hands. Anytime something drops, unless you're very trained to use your hips, you tend to grab at it with your hands. So we know that you have a lot of skill at putting your hands on things because you get millions of reps every day, right? Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
So, good luck. It's not that putting both wrists or both hands on the weapon-bearing wrist is necessarily the most secure position or the best way to stop a stab. It's not. It's just likely what you're going to do. So we'll work from the most likely thing that you're, most likely scenario.
Yeah. And in motor learning, we call that a developed perceptual motor ability. Most humans have a very highly developed perceptual motor ability with their hands. So, when you are under pressure, an adrenal stress state, you do experience deterioration in your fine motor skills, which are your fingers.
Yeah.
But that's still your main tool. And you're more likely to be successful, for example, with a punch or a hand strike or whatever, than you are trying to use your legs or something like that. Yeah. And you're always going to be trying to grab, even though your fingers don't quite work as precisely as they usually do. So it doesn't make you dependent on fine motor skills. You have a perfect storm of different constraints and dynamics coming together, and that's really just the most plausible option.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to make this is kind of a tangent, but a lot of people, they talk about fine versus gross motor skills. And in the combatives and the reality-based self-defense community, the terms have become, I guess you could say, bastardized. They're very watered down, and they actually don't mean what they mean to, say, a physiologist or a therapist or anyone who would actually use that term in a professional capacity. When people say, all our stuff is gross motor skill, what they mean is that it's simple to them. I guess in many ways it's very subjective. Yeah. And fine motor, I guess, is anything that they think is too complicated. Whereas fine motor skills actually is your ability to articulate your finger digits, and to do precise things. And gross motor is using larger limb groups like your arm and your legs all together. So one of the tropes that you'll hear is that World War II combatives or Krav Maga is based on gross motor skills, and grappling's not good because it's based on fine motor skills. The reality is quite the opposite. Striking relies very heavily on fine motor skills, how you articulate your fist, moving between different guards. And grappling relies on actually trying to use larger muscle groups to create leverage, like an arm bar, control positions such as mount, back mount, side control. The reality is that there's a lot of overlap between both disciplines, and neither one of them is necessarily more based on fine motor than the other.
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell you that in my experience, my striking accuracy diminishes under stress for me. And that I don't know enough to know whether that is a byproduct of my more extensive grappling training.
It could be. I can't say for sure what it is. I know that as I continue to study motor learning, that what's called gaze behavior, in this case gaze anchoring, is very important to whatever modality that you are very skilled in. This could be an actual situation where what combat sport you train could have a small detrimental effect in a real fight. Nothing that you couldn't overcome, but it like, for example, where you hold your gaze as a grappler could be different than a striker. And one of those could actually be more useful in the vast majority of self-defense situations. But there could be other situations where you hold your gaze as a grappler could be more advantageous, like where you really got to watch somebody's hands.
Yeah. And you see, there are videos of, MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts, or MMA veterans and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts getting stabbed or shot right at close range in a way that I think if there's a danger to sport training, it's in the mentality of being overconfident in what you can handle, such that you allow people to get too close, obscure their hands, things that you would learn early on in self-defense training. An obscured hand that's close enough for someone to reach you quickly is that's the decision point. Just because you're good at grappling you have no idea what's coming out of that hand. It's probably not candy. So
right.
That's if there, but you can teach somebody that fairly quickly. You can teach someone to watch hands. You can teach that much more quickly than you can teach somebody who knows to watch the hands how to fight somebody that is actually resisting.
Yeah. And how you train calibrates your brain. It calibrates you where to divert your attention.
Yeah.
In motor learning, that would be a attentional focus. And sometimes a lot of times, if you train a certain way, you tune yourself to focus on the wrong things, the wrong details.
Yep. Yeah. One of the things we were doing this weekend, and I think you should try to get Todd on your show, but
for sure,
he's very, very good at this. And this is something that I'm looking to incorporate into we're calling it hybrid defense now, but our self-defense program is the skill of decision making, which is, as far as I can tell, exactly what you're talking about there with where to, what's the important stuff in making the decision between using force, running, that sort of thing. So, reading body language, watching hands, all that stuff goes into. But the way to learn that is not to have someone tell you watch hands, right? It's to put yourself in those sort of short, little contained role-playing scenarios where you're making predictive decisions about what that other person's going to do based on what they're doing.
Right. Yeah. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with certain issues in motor learning, when we say decision making, we don't always mean like a conscious decision. Your brain processes things at different levels. And just because you didn't make a conscious decision to do something doesn't mean you didn't make the decision. Yes. A lot of times in the reality-based self-defense community, we you got to be automatic. It's got to be automatic. Well, automatic is kind of a myth. What's actually happening there, the phenomenon is actually your different parts of your brain and your nervous system processing information faster than your conscious mind is able to process it, and then you're responding in that moment with the decision that you've made at a lower or unconscious level.
Yeah, the conscious decision making is too slow. Your body, you will not. One of the helpful things that scenario training shows you is that you won't make conscious decisions when you feel like time is on the line, danger is imminent. The ability with working with guns, the ability to identify somebody that has a gun versus somebody that has a cell phone, that's not something you're not capable of. At least I don't believe that anyone is capable of forcing themselves to consciously sort of think through what are the visual signs consistent with a cell phone versus those consistent with a handgun. What am I seeing? And weigh all that stuff together. It's not happening on that level. It's happening way before that.
Right. There are some people who, I don't know the science behind it, but there are people who believe if you are in those situations a lot, your ability to stay calm and process at more of a conscious level increases.
Yes.
I believe Rory Miller is posited that before. So if you're a veteran, perhaps soldier, that's seen combat, or a police officer who's seen a lot of force situations, your ability to process, I guess you could say, more creatively and make more higher level decisions potentially improves. But I imagine the trade-off there is the processing is somewhat slowed, and you lose some of the useful edge that you have from a more intensely adrenalized state.
Yeah, we saw that a bit, actually. There were some one Marine Corps veteran and another guy there who had, military experience, and they were more capable of making articulate decisions in the moment. And I mean,
right.
The scenario training that I've done in the past enabled me to do a little bit more of that during the exercise than some people with less of that training.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's probably a whole other episode in itself.
Yeah, scenario training is fascinating. But
yeah, I don't feel like I've explored it enough. I've kind of, self-defense is an old hobby horse of mine, and I've done massive amounts of research on it. But nowadays, I still love thinking about it and training and things like that. But nowadays, my interest is kind of shifted towards combat sports and coaching athletes and things like that. But self-defense is a very, I don't think it doesn't get treated with as much respect as it should be, in the sense that people think they can go to a weekend course or do a few months of Krav Maga and have some level of competence in it, where in reality, self-defense is, and everyone says this, but they don't really mean it, that, it's more of what happens before the fight than the actual fight. And that entails behavioral analysis, understanding violence predictors, pre-fight cues. I mean, things that you really have to go, in most cases, outside of the martial arts to get properly educated on.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
Well, all right. Thank you for coming on, Ward. This is an awesome discussion. We covered a lot more than I thought it would, actually. I was afraid we weren't going to have enough to cover, but we went over scenario-based training and how that can be synthesized with combat sports. And we went over how combat sports is not only effective and useful to apply to weapons defense and self-defense in general, but also in some ways kind of necessary.
Yeah.
So thank you again for coming on, Ward.
Hey, thank you, man.
Guys, thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback, you can email me at josh@combatlearning.com or send me a message on facebook.com/combatlearning. Now, real quick before I go, can I ask you a huge favor? If you got value from this episode, leave us a review on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So many shows pop up and fizzle out. And we're talking about stuff that nobody else is talking about, and we want to stick around. So leaving us a review helps us a ton. Finally, the show is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.